Mr. President, I wish to begin by recognizing and welcoming the presence of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, and to convey the warm wishes of friendship and solidarity of the South African people to him and the people of Cuba. Mr. President, the South African delegation aligns itself with a statement made by Chad on behalf of the African Group, Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, and Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, in adopting UN General Assembly Resolution 787 entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba on 2 November last year, South Africa joined 187 states voting in favor of the resolution put forward each year against the US embargo. South Africa is steadfast in its unwavering support, together with the majority of the international community, in voting in favor of lifting the United States embargo. Mr. President, the United States designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism and the enforcement of Title III of the Helms Burton Act further entrenches this embargo. South Africa also stands steadfast in its support for the removal of Cuba from the list of countries designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. Mr. President, South Africa is extremely concerned by the damaging impact that the United States economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba has on the livelihoods of the Cuban people, especially the poor and vulnerable. South Africa reiterates its unwavering call to the United States to remove this unjust burden of sanctions and to opt for constructive dialogue with Cuba and not to inflict further harm on vulnerable Cuban citizens. South Africa's trade with Cuba is hampered by the US embargo and the extraterritorial application of the sanctions on third countries. The US embargo raises the legal, economic, financial, and commercial risks in doing business with Cuba. Its extraterritorial application remains a major constraint to the strengthening of bilateral trade relations. The embargo remains a major impediment for South African companies in conducting business with Cuba. Nevertheless, relations between South Africa and Cuba continue to serve as an exemplary model of South-South cooperation. South Africa has strengthened its bilateral cooperation programs with Cuba, as well as pursuing new areas of cooperation, such as infrastructure development, agriculture, education, and science and innovation. Mr. President, the United States embargo is the most significant obstacle for Cuba in its quest to realize its development objectives, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The shortages of all basic products exacerbated by the US embargo has resulted in near hyperinflation levels, especially in the food sector, where scarcity is driving prices outside of the reach of most Cubans, and particularly those who cannot rely on remittance payments. Large-scale fuel price increases in Cuba further contribute to food and other price increases, which amplify the harm inflicted by the US embargo on the Cuban population. Mr. President, the Cuban government relies on tourism and the provision of professional skills as key drivers of the economy. Cuba deploys many doctors as part of exchange programs and has an emerging pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry. The US embargo, however, continues to prevent the full potential of these sectors to be exploited, leading to hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue losses. Mr. President, South Africa commends the countries that have taken measures to mitigate the specific effects of the Helms Burton Act and to request third-party countries to support Cuba and its people by scrapping any domestic laws or regulations that continue to hamper the development of Cuba and its people. The same appeal is made towards removing Cuba from the US list designating the country as a state sponsor of terrorism. The implementation of the UN 2030 agenda remains at risk when the embargo prevents a member state from fairly participating in its own socio-economic development. My delegation will therefore vote in favor of the resolution before us, as it has done before. In closing, Mr. President, South Africa appeals once again to the international community to renew its efforts to promote constructive and transparent dialogue between Cuba and the United States, both bilaterally and through the appropriate United Nations structures, with a view to achieving the objectives of all the resolutions already adopted by the United Nations in this regard, and to ensure the sustainable further progress of the people of Cuba. I thank you.